Mark Kimmitt. He spent 9 years as the military assistant to the NATO commander in Belgium. He also led US forces in Germany, and he joins us from Washington. Mark, always a pleasure to have you on. I mean, this talk of more weapons and advanced air defense systems, what is the most effective way of helping to minimize the damage Russia is causing in Ukraine?
Well, I think that's quite obvious. The U.S. policy is the best way to minimize the suffering is the withdrawal of Russian forces and end their illegal invasion. Short of that, the best way to stop the killing of innocent civilians is providing the necessary air defense weapon systems so that this last bombing campaign, which was done by fighter bombers, is forestalled in the future because of the capability of those aircraft being shot down.
How do you square the evidence, or help at least us understand how we square the evidence of the destruction of residential areas and the number of civilian deaths with the continuing statements that come from Moscow that it only targets infrastructure that helps Ukrainian resistance, the Ukrainian military effort?
Well, I mean, the latter statement is obviously patently false. However, I think we've got to understand that the Russians, having failed on the ground, are now starting to use, rather than tactical bombing on the battlefield positions, is now moving to a strategic bombing campaign. What does that mean? I think it means very much like the Blitz in London in 1940, where Hitler believed that he could end the war not by a tactical warfare, but by bombing the civilians in London, their critical infrastructure, their historical sites such as St. Paul. And it will be interesting to see if the Ukrainian people maintain the same amount of resolve that the British people did against the Hitler's bombing campaign in London.
Is this therefore a repeat of Russian tactics in Syria to bomb civilians into submission, or at least to reduce the resistance in those civilian areas through excessive bombing?
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right. The idea is the purpose of a strategic bombing campaign is to go against civilians and infrastructure and historical locations for the specific purpose of drawing war exhaustion out of the people rather than against the soldiers. The soldiers in Ukraine will fight as long as needed. But if in the Russian mind, if enough pressure is given from the population upon President Zelensky, he might be willing to concede and start the diplomatic negotiations that will be necessary.
Do you see the future of those 5 annexed regions of Ukraine, Crimea from years ago and now more recently Kherson, Zaporizhzia, Luhansk, Donetsk, as being critical to the longer-term outcome of the war? Because if that is to be the case, the resolution for those areas looks extremely complicated after those annexations.
Well, I think at this point, the way that Ukraine believes they can solve that problem and end the complication is by militarily retaking those regions, the 4 in the Donbass and Crimea. That's a pretty tough order to accomplish, particularly if Russia continues to escalate the situation on the ground. But at this point, we sort of have a reversal of the position we did from last February. Last February, it was President Zelensky that was asking Putin for negotiations, and they were rejected. And now, oddly enough, we have Putin asking for negotiations that Zelensky is rejecting. So unfortunately, I think we're going to see a lot more conflict, a lot more war, a lot more death and killing of innocent civilians. And unless, hopefully, there can be a diplomatic breakthrough by forces outside, such as President Biden or other world leaders that can bring both of those leaders together to resolve this.
Seems as if Recep Tayyip Erdogan is trying to do exactly that, Mark. We'll follow that, of course, as we will with everything else that's happening in that conflict in Ukraine. Mark Kimmitt, thank you so much indeed.